So, I'm Eoin McAvoy from the School of Irish, Celtic Studies and Folklore, and I'll be looking at a specific tool as a case study that I've developed for our language lab in the school. So it's a map of the Gaeltacht areas, and we'll look at some photos of it, some videos of it, and then we'll talk about the rationale behind its creation. So this is the first thing the student sees. I've put it up 3 times. They only see one map, but I just want to show you that you can change the base map under the map. So it shows the 3 main Gaeltacht areas, the Donegal Gaeltacht, the Connacht Gaeltacht and the Munster Gaeltacht, as well as other areas. It's not finished yet. Belfast still has to go up. But that's what the student sees first. It's an interactive map, so the student can pan from side to side, up and down, and they can zoom in for a closer look or zoom out for a broader look as well. And they can also click for details, and each area has been created as a layer, so it can be switched on and switched off depending on what the student is researching or studying. If the student clicks on one of these large bubbles, they get basic information about the Gaeltacht. So this is about the Donegal Gaeltacht, about the community. And beneath that are just some of the traits that distinguish this dialect from the other dialects on the map. So this is important for the students when they're beginning to access more difficult Irish, that they understand the differences between the dialects. If they zoom into an area, they get a regional breakdown. So all of these smaller areas are slightly different from each other in terms of the Irish that's spoken in them. And they slowly get familiar with the place names of these areas and the differences between them. In certain areas, when you click, you bring up a little text box and there might be a link to a book. This links directly to the library. This is a book by one of our staff, Dr. Diarmuid O'Shea, on the Irish of West Kerry, so that the students have, it's to encourage the students to actually get up and go to the library, and they have the link there to the book. Another thing, if you zoom in a small bit, you get these little smaller bubbles, and these show the names of the individual townlands, which is important when the students are listening to Radio na Gaeltacht, so that they know where these areas are and that they can contextualise what they're listening to. So it might contain little bits of information about the place. Also contained in some of them are links to famous figures from the area. So Máirtín O'Kane is one of the most famous novelists in Irish language history, and so it links out to anam.ie, where they can read that figure's biography. The last thing in these little bubbles are these little ID codes for listening materials we have in our language labs to encourage the students to come. Sometimes it's just a name of the speaker, and sometimes it tells you exactly what the student will be able to listen to, whether it's about fishing or about traditions in the area or about Irish in the education system. To come back to the base map and to change it, why that can be useful, we see here for linguistics it's important to realise that the fact that these areas are on peninsulae and that they're surrounded by mountains actually protects those areas' linguistic integrity from English outside the areas, and it's much more apparent when you change the base map that you can actually see this. So that's the tool. To recap, an interactive map of the Gaeltacht areas with regional breakdown, information on dialects and local place names, with links for further research. So that was the solution to a particular problem we had. So we'll look now at what that problem was and what the rationale was for the creation of this tool. So you might remember Star na Gaeilge on your Leaving Cert course. People hated it. They thought it was awful. But what it did was provide a cultural and historical framework for the subject. It's gone now. They removed it from the course. And so students come in not knowing much about it at all. And they're at a disadvantage when they try to access higher levels of information then, that they don't have this net beneath them. So the challenge for me and for our school was to build this framework again from the bottom, but to avoid the mistakes of poor old Star na Gaeilge that was so hated, and to try and make it interesting, to try and make it accessible to a variety of learner abilities as well, that it would all be contained in the one framework. So because traditional culture is rooted in physical space, in this case I chose a map as the framework, and I used geographic information systems, or GIS, which are used a lot in the sciences and in social science, but haven't really been harnessed properly for the humanities yet, to create this framework. And Jane Nolan in the library is a great support, a great help, if anybody's thinking of using GIS. So this is the frame, really, that the learner begins with their current understanding of the map of Ireland and uses themselves as a point of reference. They use the map then as the more knowledgeable other and sort of grow using the map, assimilate the frame, and are able to access then higher levels of knowledge and categorize them into that frame. So the framework is assimilated very gradually, and this is why it's so good for a variety of users to use the map, because of the different layers. They can go as shallow or as deep as they want. And the most shallow level, at least the student gets a foundation and they know where the Gaeltacht areas are, which is no longer a given that Starna Gaeilge is off the course. Somebody who engages in depth with it becomes familiar with the frame, assimilates it further, knows where the Gaeltacht areas are, knows the place names of those individual areas within the Gaeltacht, can categorise famous writers, journalists, and knows about the Gaeltacht dialects as well. The most advanced learner then uses it as it was intended and uses it as a springboard for further research, where they can elaborate the frame above and beyond the map, so that they can look at the biographies, they can come to me in the language lab and ask for a particular recording and study the dialect of the area. So it'd be very good for a variety of users. So further potential, the maps in GIS, ArcGIS, can be used to illustrate isoglosses. They're lines that demarcate certain dialects from others. But they can also be used to show single stories from literature, from poetry and songs. Like on this is actually a Google map, but the same theory applies. It shows specific events from the story of Art O'Leary's death. So, in summation, ArcGIS was the software I used for it. It's an interactive map of the Gaeltacht. It's a repository of information that can be used to teach as well. Dialects, place names, famous literary figures. It creates a framework that the student assimilates, hopefully, and uses to categorise new information, and they learn by exploring the map. Thank you.
Okay, thanks all. We have time for one or two questions.